How are we doing? They just gave me the thumbs up, which I assume means I can go. Everybody else okay with that? Yeah, I heard one person. All right. All right. Well, I'm glad to see everybody tonight. I didn't really know how many we'd have with VBS going on, but I am glad to see everybody here tonight. I've been excited about this all week. I don't know about you guys, but I love teaching this class. I love the topic, and so I appreciate everyone being here. Also want to say thanks to Bruce for teaching last week. I know that you all benefited greatly from that. Bruce has been many more times than I have to the Holy Lands, and I appreciate him stepping in my absence last week. Before we jump into the content tonight, I just want to remind you that for those of you that do want copies of the slides, they are available on my website. The link is there on the screen. The slides, it's got copies of the slides along with, for the slides that are just pictures, it has some annotations to explain what's in the picture, which are not visible on the slides. So anyway, for those of you that are interested in that, that is available. All right, so tonight I'm going to cover 3 sites, Lord willing, if we have time. And I said this several weeks ago that one of the questions I get most frequently is, well, what's your favorite place in Israel? Bruce, I'm sure you've been asked that. You know, what's your favorite place? And it's those of you that have been, you know, it's impossible to pick one place. There are definitely a handful that stand out. I mentioned several weeks ago that Dan, Tell Dan today, is one of my favorites that I saw. For the significance of the finds there within the Tell in Dan. Also talked about how much, you know, just being on the Sea of Galilee meant to me. You know, there's all these traditional sites throughout Israel where we have no idea if that particular event happened there or not, but you can't really question the Sea of Galilee. I mean, it's the Sea of Galilee. It was the Sea of Galilee 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. It's the Sea of Galilee today, and so you can't really question that. And so it was, being on the Sea of Galilee was very meaningful in thinking about, this is where Jesus walked on the water. This is where Jesus calmed the storm, you know. So that really meant a lot to me. Tonight, we're going to cover 3 sites in the Dead Sea area. So we're a long way from Galilee, but 3 sites in the Dead Sea area, which were 3 of my favorite, one of which is near the top, and we'll get there in just a minute. But of these 3 sites, only one of them intersects with the biblical narrative. Now, I think all 3 are significant from a biblical perspective, but only one of them intersects with the biblical narrative, and that's En Gedi, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But the first one of these sites I want to talk about is Qumran. And most of you know, and if you don't, I'll tell you, Qumran is famous because that's where they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Or not all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran. Now, before we jump into the talking about Qumran itself, I want to back up a second and talk about where we are, okay? So, somebody asked me, how do you decide which screen you're going to point to? And I said, I don't know. I just always turn this way. So anyway, you know, we started off at talking about Caesarea Maritima, which is, you know, just south of Mount Carmel on the Mediterranean Sea. And then we worked our way up to the Galilee area, even up further north than where this map goes, up into the Galilean Peninsula. We spent, you know, a week or two kind of going around the Sea of Galilee and talking about the sea itself. We talked about the Jordan River 2 weeks ago, and then also 2 weeks ago we talked about the city of Jericho, which is 10 miles to the north, kind of northwest of the Dead Sea, which is here. You see the Dead Sea, the prominent body of water here in the lower part of this map. Now, when we talk about Qumran here in just a minute, Qumran is kind of on the northwestern side of the Dead Sea. So we've moved just a little bit south of Jericho when we talk about Qumran. And to drill in a little bit closer to the Dead Sea, this map, I picked this one because it has all three sites we're going to talk about tonight. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Jericho, which again is approximately 10 miles, kind of northwest of the Dead Sea. Tonight, we're going to talk about Qumran, which is right at, on the western side of the Dead Sea. Moving down, we're going to talk about En-Gedi, also on the western side, and then finally we're going to talk about Masada, and then Lord willing, next week we'll talk about the Dead Sea itself. But this is where we are. All three of these in the Dead Sea area, all three of these in the area that's considered the wilderness of Judea, the Judean wilderness. You think about the wilderness of Judea, you think about where Jesus was tempted, you think about where John the Baptist's ministry was, all of that in the wilderness of Judea. And so the first site that we're going to look at is Qumran, which is again in kind of the upper part of the Dead Sea. So Qumran, as I mentioned earlier, does not intersect with the biblical narrative. But even though it does not, it is arguably one of the most significant archaeological sites in terms of the Bible that we have today. And some of it just in confirming, the text that we have, especially as it relates to the Old Testament, okay? Now, Qumran, in the time of Jesus, so let's talk about the time of Jesus. So during the time of Jesus, Qumran was the home of the Essenes. Now, we don't talk a lot about the Essenes when we study Scripture because Scripture is more focused on two other sects of the Jews from the time of Jesus, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But the Essenes were a third sect of the Jews that were identified by the historian Josephus. Josephus, who wrote for the Romans, had two volumes that he wrote, a historian, and he mentions three sects. He identifies three sects of the Jews: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And so the Essenes were based in Qumran. Now, there is a tradition that John the Baptist was a member of the Essenes, which is extremely unlikely. Extremely unlikely. But because his ministry was in the wilderness of Judea, he is identified sometimes as being a member of the Essenes. And as a matter of fact, if you go to Qumran or you have the opportunity or you've been, they show you a video when you first get there, and one of the first things they say is John the Baptist was an Essene. Okay, very unlikely that John the Baptist was an Essene, but anyway, that is the tradition behind it. But the reason why this is such a significant site, as I've already mentioned, is that this is where the majority, not exclusively, but where the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The first of those discoveries happened in 1947, and then happened for a number of years after that, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The reason why the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is so significant, when you take all of the fragments that have been found, not all of them are at Qumran, but a lot at Qumran. When you take all of those and put them together, you have from those fragments every book of the Old Testament that is represented, except for the book of Esther and, I believe, the book of Nehemiah, which that's a little bit controversial because you will not hear that if you're at Qumran. If you're at Qumran and watch the video, they'll only mention the book of Esther, but I don't think that the book of Nehemiah is represented in those fragments. But that being said, it's an almost every book of the Old Testament was found in the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, why is that significant? Because if you look at those fragments, and the ones in those fragments includes the entire book of Isaiah. But if you look at those fragments, which were found in, I believe they were found in 4 different languages. But what you find is translation that is very, very, very similar to what we have today. And these were fragments that were all dated to the 1st century, all to the time of Jesus, which tells you that the Old Testament that was being used at the time of Jesus is the same Old Testament that we have today. And so it gives, again, it validates the text that we have as our Old Testament. So that's why this is such a significant site. Not because anything in the biblical narrative happened at Qumran, but because of what was found at Qumran. All of these fragments, including the entire book of Isaiah. Now, those of you that have been to Qumran, you know, I think you'll agree this is a mountainous area in the wilderness of Judea. This is just one picture from kind of the northern end of the Qumran site. But what you have throughout, you know, kind of this area that's, you know, again, the wilderness of Judea, is you have a lot of mountains, and the mountains are filled with caves. You know, just almost anywhere you look where you see mountains, you can look and see little, almost looks like little holes in the mountains. There's just caves all over the place. Now, I'm going to drill in a little bit. So this picture doesn't quite have it, but if I had a little bit further here to the upper right, when I drill in, this is where, so from here, we're kind of moving to the right, and you see there's a little cave up here at the top of this mountain, okay? This cave is known as cave number 1. Now, there's a lot of caves at Qumran, and they all have numbers based on what was discovered in each one of the caves. But cave number 1, as you might guess from the number, is the first cave where the scrolls were discovered, the fragments of the scrolls. And it's actually Bedouin farmers in 1947 that discovered 8 jars in this cave in 1947. Now, in those jars were the fragments that comprise the book of Isaiah. Now, these farmers had no idea what they had found, and they ended up selling the jars in Jerusalem for $16. Pretty amazing discovery to have traded hands for $16. But that was the first of many, many, many discoveries at Qumran. This is just a closer picture of cave number 1, or the entrance to cave number 1. Now, these are recreations of the original 8 jars that were found at Qumran, just to give you an idea of what the jars would have looked like when they found them in 1947. Now, I'm going to move from the northern end of the site of Qumran to the southern end of the site. This area, honestly, is just gorgeous. I mean, the picture doesn't do it justice. It is absolutely stunning. And what you see here in this valley, in this, you know, on the side of this cliff in this valley, is another cave. Now, that cave, drilling in a little bit closer, that is cave number 4. So again, they're in sequence. And I believe that this cave was discovered in 1952, so, you know, 5 years after the original cave. But the reason why I mention this cave, 1, because of the beauty of the surroundings of it, but 2, is that this is where the largest grouping of fragments were found. Over 15,000 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in this one cave, cave number 4. And those 15,000 fragments comprised around 530 scrolls. So from 530 scrolls that, you know, they decayed into these fragments, these 15,000 fragments that were found, and the estimation is that they would have come from approximately 530 scrolls. So this is a huge find. And again, why is this significant? Because, you know, they found pieces of text from the Old Testament from every book except for Esther and Nehemiah. The translations are remarkably similar to what we have today, and these were all from the time of Jesus, which tells us that during the time of Jesus, the Old Testament that they had is the same as the Old Testament that we have today. So again, to give confidence in the text that we have today, the discovery at Qumran is so significant. Not to the biblical narrative, but to the text itself and the validity of what we have today that we call the Old Testament. All right, here's just a closer view of cave number 4. I was kind of infatuated with cave number 4. I probably took 50 pictures of that one little hole in that rock there. But love Qumran. Just a few other things that have been discovered at Qumran in various archaeological excavations. I wanted to point this out because, you know, many of you, even if you've never been there, you've probably heard of things called mikveh. Mikveh, Jewish ritual baths, look like baptistries, right? And I just wanted to point out, you know, I showed you one few weeks ago up in Magdala. This is way down in the Dead Sea, and you still find mikveh. They're everywhere. And so, you know, one thing you can say when someone says, well, how could there have been places for, you know, those that responded at Pentecost to be baptized? Well, there were mikveh everywhere. Okay, there were mikveh everywhere. And this is one that was dated, again, to the 1st century, so the time of Jesus, a mikveh. This is also dated to the 1st century, and there were several of these, but this is a cistern. Kind of looks like a swimming pool. But this is a cistern used to hold their water that they used for, you know, that settlement there at Qumran. There was another one, I don't have it in the slides, but another one that was in a cylinder type shape. This one was more, you know, more of a cube or rectangle. Again, remarkably intact, but also dated to the 1st century. So anyway, that's Qumran. All right, anybody comments, questions on Qumran? Yes?
How did they get, or why did they put the scrolls in caves?
Just for storage, just storage locations for the Essenes. I mean, presumably these were scrolls that belonged to the Essenes, and that's just where they stored them. And if they hadn't have stored them the way that they stored them, in the jars, in the caves, we wouldn't have them today. I mean, it's because of the way they stored them. And it wasn't just, I am not a Dead Sea Scroll expert, but I do know that they found other text as well. I mean, they had lots of things that they stored in these caves. So this is, you think of it like a storage area. It's just a place where they stored stuff. And they did it in such a way that it lasted for over 2,000 years.
Jars made of?
Clay. The jars are made of clay.
How did they get them in there?
I don't know. It's fascinating to me. I even asked the question, how did the Bedouin farmers even get up to Cave 1? Because it just looks like it's hanging off the side of the mountain. So the question, if you didn't hear it, the question was, how did they get up there? I don't know. Now, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute, though, of a goat climbing a mountain, and it's amazing how the goats can climb those mountains. So I don't know. But somehow they got up there in, 1947, and they found that. But maybe it's not as steep as it looks like it is. I don't know. Anybody else? These are good. Yes?
It's been so long since I've been, it's hard for me to remember. But it seemed like they told us that the Essenes were escaping from Jerusalem. And that's where they hid them, where they escaped and then went on down to the ghetto.
Oh, maybe so. I don't know. The comment was that the Essenes were escaping Jerusalem, and that's where they hid them. I don't know. I know that the Qumran was the settlement of the Essenes. The Essenes were not, they were not as big of a sect as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were more mystics than the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so, but as far as, that I don't know if that's accurate or not. Yes.
Well, I remember when they announced it and was in the newspaper. It was either it was somewhere between 1948 and 1952, and I'd come home from school. And it said Dead Sea Scrolls discovered, and I couldn't wait to get home to ask Mother what I had here. She didn't know either. But it said that there were some Bedouin boys that were throwing rocks in the cave.
Oh, yeah, and broke one of the jars, right.
Is that true?
I don't know. Maybe somebody can validate that said that Bedouin boys who were throwing rocks and hit one of the jars. And I've heard the same story. I don't know whether that's how it was discovered or not. Maybe someone else. Yeah, I mean, that's the story I've heard, but I don't. Again, I don't know how they got up there to throw the rocks. I mean, it's baffling to me how, like Bonnie said, when you're there in person, it's like, how would you even go about getting up there without ropes and pulleys? And it's hard to imagine. Yes, sir.
Seems
Yeah, it definitely would be a fairly secure location, you would think. Because it's hard to access, for especially Cave 1. Some of those caves are low, like Cave 4 is much, much lower to the ground than Cave 1. Cave 1, I don't know the height, but it's way up on the top of that mountain, so.
So what happened to the people that stored all this in the jars? What happened to the essence?
That I don't know. You're welcome. All right, yes? Interesting. Yeah. If you didn't hear Clyde, he was talking about when they were there in 2008, actually seeing one of the scrolls of Isaiah from at the Jerusalem Museum, the Israel, yeah. And but I will say, when I was there last year, so they have this, you know, this at that museum, they have a whole facility called the Book of the Scroll, and almost everything in there is a reproduction. But they do now, they rotate certain pieces into that area, and they had a, I don't know, maybe a 4-foot long section of Isaiah that was the real thing. But they said that it would only be out there for another few weeks, and then they'd bring another piece out. That's the way they, I guess, the longer it's exposed to anything, even with all the environmental controls, the more likely it is to deteriorate. But it was interesting to me that how they had this gigantic thing built for it, and everything inside of it was reproduction, except for this one piece. But it's fascinating, though. Yeah. Sorry I don't have answers to all your questions. I'm skirting on the edge of my knowledge here. I think I saw a hand in the back. Anybody?
Why do you disagree with the finding of the book of Nehemiah?
Well, so the question was disagreeing with the finding of the book of Nehemiah. It's probably too lengthy of a discussion for this class. It more has to do with the knowledge of others than my knowledge, and you know, discussing it with people that I trust, and people who have PhDs in Greek and Hebrew who have told me they do not believe that Nehemiah is represented in there. So it's definitely not from my own being a subject matter expert of the original language. So, all right, anybody else? All right. All right, so next spot, En-Gedi. So En-Gedi is definitely one of my favorite spots that I went to. And En-Gedi definitely intersects with the biblical narrative in a very significant way, especially in the life of David. And so that's one reason why it was very special to me. Also, it is an extremely beautiful place. But En-Gedi, so you know, we were just talking about Qumran. Again, the northern part of the Dead Sea, on the west side of the Dead Sea. Now we're moving down, you know, directly on the west side of the Dead Sea, kind of halfway down the length of the Dead Sea, we've got En-Gedi. Now, En-Gedi, the name, you may see it spelled a couple of different ways, pronounced many different ways, but En-Gedi literally means the spring of the goat or the spring of the kid. The reason for that, if you're ever there, is obvious. One, it has a freshwater spring that runs down from the mountain, creating waterfalls, and it's beautiful. And also, it is covered with goats. They're everywhere. At least when I went in the winter, there were goats everywhere. And the goats are the specific name that they have for them are ibex. And I did look this up because I wondered, is ibex plural? And it's not. So they're ibexes if there's more than one, but they're referred to as ibex, the type of goat that is there at En-Gedi. Now, in Scripture, I've got up here on the slides the places where En-Gedi is mentioned in Scripture. And the first mention of En-Gedi is in the book of Joshua as part of the tribal allotment given to the tribe of Judah. But to me, the most significant story related to En-Gedi is the story of Saul and David. I've got the references here, but in 1 Samuel chapter 23, you read about David as he's on the run from Saul, that he hides in En-Gedi. He hides in the caves of En-Gedi. Now, we'll see this in pictures in just a minute, but you know how I mentioned earlier that it's not just at Qumran where there's mountains filled with caves. It's all throughout the wilderness of Judea. You see these mountains that are just filled with caves. And En-Gedi's the same way. En-Gedi is just filled with caves. And so this is a mountainous area, lots of caves. There's access to fresh water. I mentioned the spring. There's access to fresh water. This was the place where, a place where David hid from Saul when he was on the run. And then the next chapter in 1 Samuel 24, Saul goes into one of these caves to relieve himself and does not know that David is in the same cave. We know the story, right? Doesn't know that David's in the same cave. And what does David do? He cuts off the corner of his robe. Cuts off the corner of his robe. And, that again, just, this place is like the Sea of Galilee in that it's not because of archaeological excavations there. It's because this is the place. Being there and knowing that when David was on the run from Saul, this is where he hid. This is where, without Saul knowing it, he cut off a corner of his robe, knowing it happened at this place. It's pretty humbling to think about. David mentions it again. It's mentioned again by David, recorded in 2 Samuel 22. Solomon mentions it in Song of Solomon. And you've got a couple of other mentions of En-Gedi, which, references to En-Gedi in Scripture. But again, to me, the most significant event that happened there was David hiding out from Saul in the caves and the mountains at En-Gedi. Here is, I could have done an entire night of just showing you pictures of goats at En-Gedi. These are the ibexes. And they're not just at En-Gedi. I mean, we saw them everywhere, kind of down that whole western side of the Dead Sea, just running down the mountains, just everywhere. And so here's one picture of the ibexes, another picture, getting some leaves out of a tree, kind of hanging off the side of one of the mountains. But they're everywhere. So the name is, again, Spring of the Goat, freshwater spring, lots of goats there. So the name completely makes sense. This is just one view of the mountains of En-Gedi. Again, looks very similar to Qumran from a terrain standpoint. You get closer, again, you can see in the side of the mountain here at En-Gedi, all these little caves that are in the mountain. Again, it looks just like Qumran. Then I took this picture of this goat. This thing looked like just a sheer cliff, and this goat is just running down it like it's nothing. It's amazing. It's amazing to me. But there are, at En-Gedi, for those of you that haven't been there, at En-Gedi, there is a trail that you can take that will take you from kind of the bottom up to the top of the spring, where the freshwater spring kind of begins. And so you can take a trail up to the top. And as you go up this trail, there are two waterfalls. Now, not huge waterfalls, small waterfalls coming from this spring, but this is referred to as the lower waterfall. This is the upper waterfall. Again, not like a roaring huge waterfall, but again, just kind of trickling down through the mountain. And you can take a trail all the way up to the top of this. It's not showing up great on this screen, but this is, kind of halfway up, climbing up the trail in En-Gedi and turning back around and looking out at the Dead Sea. So you've got the Dead Sea, which you can sort of make out here in the background, the water looking down off of the mountain there at En-Gedi. We got to the top, and this was a special moment for me. I don't know how many of you know Dr. Rodney Cloud, who was a longtime professor at Lipscomb University. He was a professor in Greek and Hebrew for many years, has a PhD, I think, in both. I know his PhD on Hebrews from Hebrew Union. He's now a professor. In his mid-80s, he's a professor of archaeology at a different university. He was the leader of our trip, and if you know Dr. Cloud, you know that his passion in Scripture is David. And so it was really neat when we got to the top to listen. He taught a lesson on David. And just to be standing in the place where David, you know, one of these caves around us is where David hid from Saul, and he's teaching a lesson about David. So that was a pretty neat moment. One of the few times I have pictures with people in them, but it was a pretty neat moment there up on top of En-Gedi, listening to Dr. Cloud talk about David. Now, the last thing I've got on En-Gedi is I have a short video, if you'll bear with me here. This has some personal pictures in it. I didn't want to redo my video. But anyway, this is just to give you some idea, for those of you that haven't been to En-Gedi, what the terrain is really like. It's hard to tell from pictures, what does this place really look like? And so I wanted you to be able to see the video to understand what the terrain at En-Gedi. And gentlemen, don't worry about the sound. It's got some music, but don't worry about it if it doesn't have any sound. All right. Actually a little longer than I remembered, so thanks for your patience there. All right, the final place I want to talk about is called Masada. And Masada is not part of the biblical narrative, but I think it's an important site in understanding the context of the time in which the events of the New Testament occurred. Masada, just, again, back to this same map. So we started off in Qumran, we moved down to En-Gedi, and now we're down more on the southern end of the Dead Sea at Masada. Masada literally means fortress, and the reason why it is called Masada is that, we'll see this on the next, or no, it's on this slide too. Herod the Great built two significant palaces up on top of Masada. Now, Masada is a mountain, or probably more literally a mesa, because it's flat up on top. But Herod the Great built 2 palaces and fortified the top of this mesa, among many things that he built in this area during his lifetime. Now, he built these 2 palaces and he fortified Masada between 37 and 31 BC. So we're talking, a number of years before Jesus was born. But, think about Herod the Great, the significance that he plays in the story of Jesus. Again, as I said, all the way back in the first week, we talked about Caesarea Maritima, which was built by Herod the Great, that Herod the Great was great, not because he was a great man, but because he was a great builder. He built so many things, both in the city of Jerusalem and all around Palestine. I mean, all over. He built incredible things. And, one of these incredible things that he built was the fortress up on top of Masada. Now, everything that we know about Masada, again, this is not from the biblical narrative. Everything we know about Masada comes from 2 sources. One, from the excavations that have taken place there. And 2, from the writings of Josephus. Now, I mentioned Josephus earlier in talking about Qumran, but Josephus also wrote extensively about Masada. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But again, Herod the Great built these 2 palaces, 37, 31 BC. The palaces, though, were essentially abandoned by the sons of Herod the Great after his death in 4 BC. For those of you that were in Nelson's class on Sunday, Nelson went through the sons of Herod the Great. Well, they essentially abandoned Masada after his death, and the site was taken over by Jewish zealots. Now, that is something that does intersect with the biblical narrative, because you read in the New Testament about individuals who are referred to as zealots. Well, what did that mean? What were they zealous against? The Romans. They were incensed that the Romans occupied and controlled Palestine. And so when you see an individual in Scripture referred to as a zealot, they were ones who were, it was their mission in life to get the Romans out of Palestine. So after Herod the Great, after, the sons kind of let this go vacant, it is taken over by Jewish zealots, specifically known, these zealots, as the Sicarii. Sounds like a superhero villain, the Sicarii, but the Sicarii were real. They were Jewish zealots known for carrying these kind of sickle-shaped swords, and they were the ones who occupied this fortress on top of this mountain after the death of Herod the Great. Moving forward into, between 66 and 73 AD, you have what is referred to as the Jewish-Roman War, or the Great Jewish Revolt, however you want to refer to it. In the middle of that, AD 70, what happened? What happened in AD 70? Jerusalem was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Well, the last great stronghold of the Jews during this conflict was Masada. Okay? It was Masada. This is like the last place that they had. It was the last place where the Jews were holed up on top of Masada. And ultimately, depending on which source you look at, it was either 73 or 74 AD, the Romans finally conquered Masada. They sieged Masada with 8,000 troops and defeated the Jews at Masada. Now, here's where the story, to me, gets interesting, because there is a traditional story of what happened at Masada. And then there is a dissenting view of what happened at Masada, okay? The traditional story comes mostly from Josephus. As I already mentioned, everything we know about Masada comes from excavations and from Josephus. Josephus records that at the Romans conquering Masada, that what really happened was that the Sicarii, the Jews that were there at Masada, that they committed mass suicide at Masada just before. I mean, the Romans had laid Masada in siege. Their defeat was imminent. And so instead of being captured or killed by the Romans, they decided in a mass suicide to kill themselves. 960 Jews that killed themselves in a mass suicide. That's the traditional story from Josephus. Now, the question is, well, how would Josephus know that? If they all killed themselves, how would Josephus know that that's what happened? Well, the way Josephus records it is that there were 2 women and 3 children who were hiding in a cistern. Now, I just showed you a picture of a cistern from Qumran, that they were hiding in a cistern. And there was a rabbi who was speaking in the synagogue that had been built at Masada by the Jews. And in this synagogue, this rabbi known as Ben Yair was giving a speech, and what he said was, we're going to draw lots, and we're going to select 10 men, and those 10 men are going to wipe us out. They're going to kill us all. And that the way Josephus records it is that, or the way that is explained is that the women heard this happening and left, and ultimately passed the information to Josephus, okay? That is the traditional view, okay? I will tell you that in my opinion, I don't think that adds up. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. There are a number of scholars who also do not think that that's what happened, that what actually happened was that they were just routed by the Romans. 8,000 versus 900, ultimately they were defeated. But we'll talk more about that in just a minute, okay? So that's Masada. So this is a shot from a distance of the main mesa where the structures at Masada were built. Masada, this mesa is 1,500 feet tall. Now, what is Masada right next to? The Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on planet Earth, right? So it's 1,500 feet tall, but it's just a few feet above sea level because the Dead Sea is so low, okay? So even though this is a 1,500 foot tall mesa, it's barely above sea level, okay, because of where it's located. But this is the mesa. This is a shot from up on top of the mesa of the Judean wilderness that surrounds it, leading up to the Dead Sea. So you can see the Dead Sea there in the background, with the Judean wilderness there in the foreground. Beautiful views of that area from the top of Masada. If you notice in the lower right-hand corner, there is a little square, okay? So I'm going to drill in a little closer to that little square. And for those of you that have been to Masada, you've probably seen all around this mesa, there are these squares. They're all around it. And what these are excavations of the Roman encampments from when they laid siege to Masada. So these are all around the mesa. I mean, I could have shown you pictures of this, but I would have been just, continually showing you the same things over and over and over again. They're all the way around this mesa. But fascinating, because again, the Romans used 8,000 soldiers to lay siege to Masada, and so they had a lot of encampments around this mountain. This is one of, so now we're up on top inside of the area that would have been fortified. You can see the outer wall here, and this is one of the gates through the outer wall, which is referred to as the Snake Gate. And this was the main entrance to Masada. We know that because we know the route, the road, if you will, that would have been used to get to the top of this fortress has been uncovered and is actually a hiking trail today. Bruce told me he went down it. I didn't have time. I would love to go up it and down it. I would love to climb to the top of this rather than take the cable car. But this would have been the main entrance to Masada, the Snake Gate. This is the remains of a quarry that have been uncovered on top of the mountain, quarry that would have been used to dig out the rock that was used to build all the structures that were built on top of Masada. So kind of cool to see where the rock came from. This is just one view of one of the palace complexes, one piece of it actually. This is the Northern Palace Complex. And you can just tell just by how much is just in this one shot, how significant this palace, this is again one of two palaces, there's a Northern Palace and a Western Palace, but just how significant just one palace was. You've got storehouses in here, over here is a bathhouse. What's behind me is the kind of palace proper, like the living quarters and the recreational quarters and all that. But an incredible structure up on top of this mountain. This is a close-up of one of the storehouses from inside the palace. This particular one would have had holes in the ground which were used to store wheat and barley in the storehouses. You've got over here on the right a two-handled wine jar from the time period. Now, this is a very confusing picture. And I'm going to try to bring some clarity to this. I am taking this picture from the top of the mountain straight down. And what I am showing you are the remains of a balcony that's on the side of the mountain. Now, this is an artist's rendition of what I'm showing you here. That at the edge of the Northern Palace, that Herod the Great built 3 terraces or balconies down the side of the mountain. When you think about this, this is over 2,000 years ago. I mean, how much work would have gone into building this? But like a stair step with an upper balcony, a middle balcony, and a lower balcony, and the remains of all 3 are still there today. I mean, they're not really recognizable as balconies today, but what this is I'm standing on the top balcony, the upper balcony, looking down onto the remains of the middle balcony that he built into, or had built into the side of this mountain. And this is, where it's at today. And you can see people standing, if you look closely, here's the upper balcony, here's the middle balcony, and the lower balcony, the remains of all 3, which are still there today. So again, a great builder, not a great man, but a great builder, built incredibly impressive things. This is the remains of a bathhouse that's just right outside the Northern Palace complex. A few weeks ago, we talked about a bathhouse from the Byzantine period that had been uncovered at Beth Shean. It's remarkable, even though this one was significantly older than the one at Beth Shean, how it's similar. It's very similar. It has it has the same kind of 3 areas as the bathhouse, uncovered at Beth Shean. One of those areas is a sauna. And this one, I put this picture in there not to show you me, but to show this is a doorway that's in the bathhouse. And the thing that struck me about this doorway was, 1, it's really skinny, and 2, it's really short. So maybe that tells us something about the stature of Herod the Great. Maybe he was a little man. I don't know. But, almost no one in our group could get through this without stooping down. So anyway, whether that tells us something about Herod or not, I don't know. But anyway, this particular sauna was easier to capture a single picture that kind of showed how the whole thing worked. How does a sauna work 2,000 years ago? Well, what you've got on the floor, so I'm kind of taking this picture down. I'm looking at the floor with the back wall in the background, okay? And what you've got on the floor are these pillars that were built to hold up the floor of the sauna, okay? Now, you can see the different layers of the floor that still remain up on top of these pillars. And then what would have been under the floor is a hole in this building that would have had fire coming up from around it. And the slaves would be stoking the fire while water was coming in through that hole in the side of the building. And the fire would be warming up the water. And then the water would come in and fill all the area underneath the floor. And then you notice how it's got pipes in the walls. So these are the walls. You've got pipes running up in the walls. The water would come up into the walls. And then what they would do is take cold water and dump it on the floor, dump it on the walls, and it would create steam. And that was a steam room 2,000 years ago. Similar concept to steam rooms today. You dump cold water on top of hot lava rocks and you create steam. They dumped hot water on top of, or cold water on top of hot floors and walls and generated steam. And so this was Herod the Great's bathhouse at Masada. Now, I mentioned earlier the story about the 2 women and the 3 children that hid out in the cistern and overheard Ben Yair telling what we're going to do about we're going to cast lots and we're going to pick 10 men and those 10 men are going to massacre all of us. Well, this is the cistern that's there at Masada, that's been uncovered at Masada. And I wish I had taken a picture of the distance between the cistern and the synagogue, but I didn't. And the reason why I wish that I had taken that picture was to show that I don't think it's possible that someone could have been in this cistern and heard what was happening in the synagogue. I just think that's extremely unlikely. And so that's why I doubt that detail of the story of Josephus. I think Josephus largely is very accurate in his writings. That detail of that story just doesn't add up to me. That's my opinion, because I look at it and go, I don't think you could have had 5 people in this cistern that could have heard what was happening as far away as the synagogue were. But anyway, this is the cistern that has been uncovered at Masada. This is the synagogue, and again, I wish I'd taken a picture to show the distance between the two, but this is the synagogue that would have been built after the time of Herod the Great by the Jews that had occupied Masada. Another significant thing about Masada, very like Qumran, is that Dead Sea Scrolls have been discovered at Masada. And not to the degree, the number that have been found at Qumran, but this is part of the outer casement wall that surrounded Masada. And these are storehouses that were built into the wall. And these storehouses are actually today referred to as the casement of the scroll, because in one of these storehouses was found a jar that had in it fragments from the book of Ezekiel, specifically the story in Ezekiel of the dry bones. And so again, not the number of fragments that were found at Qumran, but still, a significant finding at Masada. All right, this may be the last one that I have, and then the lesson will be yours. So, talked about the Romans laying siege to Masada in 73 AD. Well, Masada is up on top of a mountain. So how do they ultimately attack and conquer Masada? Well, they did it by building a gigantic ramp. And that ramp is still largely intact today. I mean, it comes up almost all the way to the bottom, or to the top of the mountain, to the base of the casement walls, and they came up that ramp and obliterated the casement wall there and came right into the city. But this is a picture kind of looking down on top of that ramp that they built out of sand and rock and dirt to get up to the top of Masada. So anyway, all right, I think that's the last slide. I do have a video, but we're past our time, so I'm not going to show the video. If anybody wants to stay later and watch it, you're welcome to stay later and we'll watch it. But otherwise, does anybody have any comments or questions? I'm sorry I couldn't answer everybody's questions about the Essenes. I'm not an expert on the Essenes, but I appreciate you guys having questions and being here tonight.
Well, dog, that's what I meant to say, that they had escaped Jerusalem and were going down to Masada.
Gotcha.
So that's when they
Hid them in Qumran? Gotcha. Yes, sir.
These caves that you mentioned, are they man-made or natural?
That's a good question. The question was, are the caves man-made or natural? My assumption was they were natural, but I could be wrong on that. I didn't ask that question, have not researched it, so I just made an assumption that they were natural. If anybody knows different, please tell me, but my assumption was they were natural caves, mostly because they're everywhere.
For them being so many, you would think it's natural.
Yeah, there are caves all over the place. So my assumption is they're natural. If somebody else knows differently, again, correct, tell me that. But that's something I have never asked, so I don't know.
I think there's signs in number 4 that maybe they expanded it.
Gotcha. So Bruce says there's signs that, like in K4 at Qumran, that maybe they expanded it, which would make sense. I mean, if they were storing that many things in there, but yeah, I mean, just going down through the wilderness of Judea and all the mountains, there's just little holes all in them. So my assumption was that they were natural, but this has also been occupied for many centuries. So, anybody else? Yes.
When Herod the Great built the last temple.
Yes. Yes. Herod the Great built the temple in the time of Jesus. Well, we'll talk about that when we get to Jerusalem. We'll talk about the what's actually left of the mount that today is known as the Wailing Wall, which would have been the western retaining wall of the temple that Herod built. Nelson's actually covered that quite a bit already in his class, talking about, Herod the Great was making Jerusalem his showplace and rebuilt the temple and the splendor around the temple, and he built a lot. But yes, he did. He built the temple that was in use at the time of Jesus. Absolutely. All right. Well, you all have a fantastic rest of the week. Thank you for being here tonight.